Hi, this is Ian Wright and the Osteopath, and I am going to give you a little podcast discussion on osteopathy and specific learning and behavioural difficulties. So this is actually going to be 5 different, there's so much to talk about here. So I'm going to have 5 different podcasts. This one is going to be an introduction, talking about general principles. And then I'm going to talk in the next 4 about very specific issues like dyslexia, the different types of dyslexias. And then I'm going to talk about ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. And I'm going to talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. I'm going to talk about sensory integration and other disorders like that. And I'm going to talk about developmental, coordinational, or cerebellar disorders, DCD. So those I'm going to talk about in detail, but today I just want to talk about the general and just the idea that how could osteopathy be relevant to work with these kinds of children? Now, to kind of qualify this, I have to talk about my history personally with this. I've been teaching osteopathy, pediatric and cranial osteopathy for the last 25 years internationally. And an area I've always had a specific interest in and always wanted to lecture in and always chosen to lecture in is osteopathy when working with specific learning difficulties and specific behavioural difficulties and autistic spectrum disorder and all of these types of things, because I think it's a huge area and it's surprising what we can actually do and how we can help that. And this, I suppose, podcast is as much for my colleagues as it is for people with children who have these kind of difficulties, because it's a relatively unknown area, but it's something I very much like to focus and spend a lot of my time working with. So I suppose, what can osteopathy do? Well, I think what we need to do is work out actually what particular causes can come into these particular issues. So as osteopaths, what I do, especially using cranial techniques are very gentle techniques which work with the bones of the skull and work with the fluid function in the body and the nervous system, and especially we're interested in specific elements which are balance, function, freedom of movement. Everything has to have a freedom of expression, and that's all really, if you came down to saying what will an osteopath do? An osteopath's interested in freeing up things that don't work. That's all I do. I spend my whole day freeing blocks, really, and getting things to work in a balanced, coherent, functional way, be it in whatever system in the body. And we use our hands to do so very gently. And that's really it. That's the summary of the whole thing. Okay, so talking a little bit more generally and specifically around specific learning difficulties, they can come from a variety of causes. I'm going to talk about this in much more detail when I talk about each specific disorder, but I'm just going to talk in general. So, threads that can affect the perfect freedom of expression. So what we're looking at, as I just said, is freedom of movement, balance, function, full expression of, be it the nervous system or postural function or whatever. What can stop that is the question. What can stop free, full function? Now, one thing, the most obvious thing, can be the genetics. A family history. If there's a genetic history, for example, of specific dyslexia, that can run very much in families. And so it can affect gene expression. And that's something. Actually, as we get into this a little bit more in some of the forthcoming ones, genetics is a complicated area. What actually allows for one child to express a certain problem and not another is an interesting area, and that's what we've kind of the area this kind of grey area we want to look. But genetics plays one role, and it's not necessarily the main role. It's one role in the formation and the predisposition to some of these issues. There are a whole world of other things that we have to discern, and what I'm interested in doing when I'm working is trying to work out what threads are involved. What are these elements that cause blocks in free and full expression? And there can be a huge amount. Number one, pregnancy. There can be a variety of issues in pregnancy: subtle infections, early births, illnesses, operations, accidents in pregnancy, etc., etc. There's a variety of mild issues that can affect, because what we have is an embryo fetus that's developing inside, and obviously the development of the nervous system is very, very important, and very subtle things can affect the full expression of development. One example being is in developmental cerebellar or coordinational disorders, the cerebellum, which is very involved, which is a part of the brain at the back of the brain, is one of the last parts of the nervous system to develop. The brain develops very early on, actually, but it matures very late on. And actually, the cerebellum is one of the last parts of the brain to develop fully. It develops actually mostly in the last 5-6 weeks pre-birth, when actually everything else is pretty much developed. Now, for example, if there are certain illnesses from 35 weeks of pregnancy, it can affect some of this subtly. For example, if you have chicken pox or preeclampsia, these can have certain effects, etc. So what we're looking at causes of blocks again. Birth is another big one that osteopaths, especially cranial osteopaths, are fascinated by. Even a normal delivery can have a variety of effects. There's a huge forces of compression, rotation, and torsion that's put through the head and neck in a normal delivery. That's just a normal delivery, especially if you have, for example, a prolonged first stage of delivery. If the head is down low and you're contracting hard against the cervix, which is not fully dilated, it puts a huge amount of compression in. The delivery itself, depending on position, even in a normal position, there's a lot of compression rotation through the head on neck. This can cause problems if there's a lot of force, and forces produce moulding of the cranial bones, which can take some time to unravel. Now that's in a normal delivery. Abnormal deliveries where there's forceps, where there's ventouse, where there is distress. Distress creates shock in the nervous system. Shock creates tone in the nervous system, for example, and that can cause subtle difficulties later. So abnormal deliveries where there's shock, trauma, minor issues with blood supplies, can have some subtle effects. What I'm interested here when we're looking at some of these specific learning and behavioural difficulties, we're looking at real subtleties, subtle things that block full and free expression. So, birth. Now, after that, there's histories of illnesses, operations, accidents. Any trauma can have some sort of effects. Any illnesses, young illnesses, can have effects. And then you've got things like nutrition. If a child has, say, for example, a gluten intolerance or an allergy or a dairy intolerance, it can have an effect on their immune system. Now, that has an effect and can have an effect in terms of the gut physiology, specifically more in certain issues like autistic spectrum disorder. There can be a gut correlation in some cases. ASD, in my personal view, there is an immune and autoimmune component affecting the nervous system. The immune system and the nervous system have very close links, and this is being found out more and more in medicine. And research is heading more in this direction, and talking a lot about things like the gut biome, the natural bacterial flora in the gut, and how that can be affected by things like caesarean section. So we've got this huge variety of potential issues that can cause some kind of compromise in full and free expression and function of the nervous system and other systems in the body. And our jobs is to find that And actually, as the founder of osteopathy called Andrew Taylor Still in the 1870s said, find it, fix it, and leave it alone. Free up blocks. That's what we're interested in. So, areas, and the interesting thing when you're looking at specific learning and behavioural difficulties, they can cross over. When I was working 25 years ago, a child would have one diagnosis, ADD, say, or autism, or ADHD. Now, we tend to have 3 or 4 overlapping diagnoses, and that's much more normal. It makes much more sense because actually children express certain different things. Now, the causes can cross over a lot. For example, if you're looking at dyslexia and you're looking at dyspraxia, coordinational issues, symptomatically they can very much cross over. They can be an effect of the part of the brain called the cerebellum, and that can be very important in some dyslexias, but it actually can be very important in certain dyspraxias. So when I'm looking at a child, I look at actually how the functional freedom of their system in terms of my diagnosis. I don't diagnose using the DSM-4, some of the diagnostic tools where an educational psychologist or early intervention people would look at. I'm looking more at how things feel for me, and certain expressions or lack of expressions reflect certain issues to me. So I kind of have my own view on how certain children's compromises, and really freeing those up is as I've said, is more of my thing. So all of these areas can cross over. That's why I'm kind of talking about a general view. And in terms of free neurodevelopment, allowing the nervous system to fully express itself in development and what can block it, that it can be a much more different kind of view, as I've kind of said. Now, what's fascinating for us is we can pick up some of these stories and these issues, or these lack of expression and balance and function, and also, which is a very important in dyspraxias, dyslexias, and actually ASD, is a lack of midline, which is actually the child's body understanding where its center is, which it allows a left and right balance to form from it, and it's very important in coordination, but it's also important, and actually you see midline problems with reading issues in dyslexia, or auditory processing issues or core processing issues. They often have difficulties with holding their midline. Their mechanical posture is incorrect, and you'll see these children, and very much true in children with dyspraxias. They have a poor functional midline, and you can see it. Their posture is poor, and actually, interesting enough, as they improve, you hope their posture improves, and it's very visible when to parents is the child's standing better, and that's actually is a reflection of an improved function of their nervous system. So posture is very important, and it's important manifestation of this. So we can pick up patterns in children, babies, newborns. That's why it's so important to check newborns, because we're stopping, hopefully we're trying to stop things before they start. It's preventative, really, is getting everything. If you get everything free and functioning properly in a newborn baby or a very young child, it maximizes their full potential expression, and that's what we're interested in, is full expression in every system, be it their gut or their nervous system or their posture. It's all the same thing as far as I'm concerned. But when we tend to see children often in practice is they come in between 5 and 7 years old, where things are noticed at school. They're not performing quite well. They're not reading, they're not processing, their memory, short-term memory isn't so good, or they're having difficulty sitting still, or having difficulty in socialization. So all these different areas start to come in within a normal situation. Now, there are some kids who, especially boys, 5, 6 years old, they just aren't ready to sit down. And there's nothing wrong with their nervous system, except that they just want to play and run around, and the system isn't necessarily right for them. But there are other areas in children where there are difficulties in speech and language expression, or reading, visual processing, or auditory processing, or the ability for the nervous system to sit in a quiet place and to receive as opposed to get locked into function, which is true in ADHD, etc. So we'll go into all of this in the next four or more podcasts in much more detail with specific issues. And again, I'm just going to give you my experience and my views. It's not definitive, it's just a viewpoint. But it's probably a different viewpoint than we're used to seeing, because it just comes from experience and working with literally thousands of these children for the last 25 years. Okay, we'll get back to this. I wish you well.